Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to our second of a three-part series on genomic newborn sequencing. I am Erica Barnes. I'm the director of the Minnesota Rare Disease Advisory Council, and I'm joined with a great group of experts to talk us through kind of our next topic in this series on some of the logistical and ethical challenges to implementing genetic testing into public health programs. I just want to go over a few housekeeping things, and then I'm going to pass it over to Amy Gavligio. So this meeting is being recorded. And we will be sending out the recording after we have this webinar. So just so you all know that we're recorded. We will have it after the presentation. We'll have a time for Q&A. We've asked that you put that in the Q&A function. We've disabled the chat just so that we can keep track of the questions. So if you have questions as we're going through the presentations, just put those in the Q&A. So thank you again so much for joining. And I'm going to turn it over to Amy. So Amy Gavligio is a genetic counselor and founder of Kinetics Consulting. She provides newborn screening, genomics, and rare disease implementation, policy, and advocacy services. She's worked in newborn screening in the rare disease space for the past 18 years, and she currently works with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Association of Public Health Labs, Expecting Health, RTA International, and several other rare disease genomics organizations. So she also serves on a number of committees and boards, and is just a wonderful expert. And I will add personally a real advocate for people living with rare diseases and really champions the community. So thank you, Amy, and I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce the speakers.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica. And yeah, Paige Aaron, if you want to put up the slides, perfect. So thank you and welcome everyone to our genomic sequencing in newborns webinar today, which will be focused on moving from the concept of sequencing healthy newborns to the practicality of actually doing so, focusing particularly on the logistics and ethical considerations that really must be addressed in order to truly achieve the goals of improved health outcomes and mitigation of harm in these programs. Next slide. So as a quick reminder, today's webinar, as Erica mentioned, is being hosted by the Minnesota Rare Disease Advisory Council in conjunction with the Minnesota Genomic Newborn Sequencing Work Group. And the mission of our gNBS working group is to foster understanding, connection, and informed dialogue around the topic of genomic newborn sequencing in Minnesota, in order to position us as a state to lead the nation in ethical, innovative, and family-centered approaches to genomic newborn sequencing. So again, this work group includes members from numerous organizations throughout the state, as well as experts in newborn screening, public health, rare disease, and advocacy. If you would like to stay connected, which we very much encourage you to do so, the website link and QR code is shown there on the right. Next slide. So as Erica mentioned, this is the second webinar in a three-part series. For those of you who weren't able to make the first meeting in November or want to rewatch it because it was truly that good, you can find it on the Minnesota RDAC site, and we will have a QR code and link to at the end of the webinar today that will take you to that recording as well. So the third part of this webinar series will actually be an in-person and virtual hybrid event on February 12th at the Wilder Center in St. Paul. Very much encourage you to come or listen in, however works best for you. Next slide. So before turning it over to our incredible speakers, I do want to set a quick foundation again of what we are talking about when we say genomic newborn sequencing, because it can mean a number of different things depending on context and kind of who you're talking to. For the purpose of today, and if you want to click Paige Aaron, we are focused on really the screening application of genomic newborn sequencing, which means we are not talking about using it in a NICU setting where we have children who have, are sick and need an explanation for what's going on. We're really talking about the application in seemingly healthy newborns, so much more of this screening paradigm. And what we're talking about is what we're kind of calling targeted whole genome sequencing, where we're looking at a set panel of genes that correspond with childhood onset, often treatable, actionable, or manageable diseases. And so that's really what we're talking about when we talk about newborn whole genome sequencing for today. And next slide. So as I mentioned today, we're really going to be focusing on lessons learned from existing kind of traditional newborn screening programs, as well as ongoing newborn sequencing projects, where we think about some of these ethical and public policy issues that we know exist with newborn screening, things like consent and permission versus a mandated program, concepts of genetic privacy and data sharing, equity and access to the screen, but also the downstream diagnoses and treatments. How do we measure benefits? What do we do with uncertainty and potential harms? And how do we incorporate education and engagement? And what we know or suspect is that these issues that we know we have in regular newborn screening are likely to be intensified or at least modified and need consideration as we think about expanding these programs to include neonatal whole genome sequencing. So with that, you can go to the next slide. I cannot tell you how lucky we are to have these three speakers today. They are truly just pillars in thinking about this topic, and I am just honored to be able to introduce them. So I'm going to introduce all three of them right away, and then turn it over. Natasha will be our first speaker. So Natasha Bonhomme is a national leader in newborn screening, genomics, and patient-centered design, and the founder of Expecting Health. She brings nearly 2 decades of which I personally have been honored to be a part of experience in maternal and child health, works with families, communities, and decision makers to support the real-world implementation of emerging genomic and health programs through clear science-based guidance. Her work focuses mostly on practical, trusted approaches that center public engagement, ethical decision-making, and the realities of health systems. Our second speaker today is Dr. Aaron Goldenberg. He is a professor and vice chair in the Department of Bioethics at Case Western Reserve University. He is also director of the Bioethics Center for Health and Genomics there, and his work has focused on the ethical, legal, and social issues, often referred to as ELSI, associated with research and clinical care for rare diseases and the integration of new genomic technologies into research, clinical, and public health settings. Dr. Goldenberg is currently the co-chair of the Ethical, Legal, Social, and Policy Implications Subcommittee of the Association of Public Health Laboratories. And our final speaker today will be Dr. Wendy Chung. She is the Chief of Pediatrics at Boston Children's Hospital and the Mary Ellen Avery Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. She is a clinical and molecular geneticist and has led newborn screening pilot studies for spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or DMD, and now the Guardian study, which looks at genomic newborn sequencing. Dr. Chung has identified the genetic basis of more than 60 rare diseases, and she leads the Guardian study to expand newborn screening for genetic disorders and advance development of personalized therapies for children with these conditions. Dr. Chung has received the National Organization of Rare Disorders Rare Impact Award and the Health Equity Award from the Global Genes, and is a member of the National Academy of Medicine. So I hope those bios get you as excited as I am to hear from these speakers today. And so with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker. And Natasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amy. And it's been my honor to have so much of my career run alongside yours. And again, thank you to the organizers of this session. It really is an exciting time. I do want to note that I will be using the term genomic newborn screening, which for some is controversial, but I'm using that terminology really to get into the context of what would this mean to be integrated into our newborn screening programs today, and really thinking about all of the issues that Amy brought up. So just wanted to flag that from the beginning. But again, thank you so much for having me, and it is a really exciting time to be talking about this. Next slide. Oh, my slides look different than what I sent in, so sorry about that. So when thinking about this time and why right now is particularly an important time for genomic sequencing in the newborn period. As has been mentioned, there are a number of large-scale research and pilot programs that are happening in the US as well as globally, and they have been for a number of years. I know we'll talk a little bit more about that later in this session. And so we are getting actual real-world evidence around feasibility, outcomes, access, and in particular, the family experience. This is something that for a long time, was discussed as far away and hypothetical, but it's here, and it has been here, at least within the realm of research and really trying to test out and see what does this look like in terms of implementing genomic sequencing, as Amy laid out, from that perspective of a larger population. At the same time, we know that families and communities have a number of different questions about these programs. Families have questions about health and healthcare in general. And yeah, I'm sorry about the font. I did not mean for this piece, not only of the interest of rare diseases to be bigger than anything else. On my slides, it's actually smaller, but that's included here because we know that rare disease families are such a driving force and really can elevate the concerns and the reasons why we need better and emerging technologies. And at the same time, when thinking about incorporating sequencing into a public-based program, we need to think about all of the families that this could affect and really getting those perspectives in early. Public engagement really is essential in building understanding and trust and that shared expectation of what this really could mean. So often I think we know in our work as well as in our personal lives, oftentimes when people get the most upset or the most concerned is when the expectation really doesn't meet the reality. So anything we can do to really have those pieces be harmonized from the beginning as best as we can is really important. Next slide, please. Okay, that looks better. So when I'm talking about public engagement, what do I mean? I really wanted to split this into the components and the purpose and have them kind of match each other a bit. Public engagement really at the end of the day is about a two-way communication. I'll present a framework, I think in the next slide, that shows some steps to getting there, but it really is about that shared information back and forth. It's not just the education or pushing information out, but really having a clear understanding of where a group is at. What are we thinking about? What is important? What is valued? What are the barriers out there? It also provides an opportunity to co-create. And that's so important so that people really can feel invested and feel like this isn't a program or something that's being done to me or at me, but me and my community are a part of this. We got to contribute to it. And they actually took our perspective or took our advice. Inclusion, of course, is important. We have a range of different perspectives, especially when thinking about something that's emerging, like genomic sequencing and like looking at all of this potential data and information that we could gather so early in a baby's life, but really thinking about all the different viewpoints that are out there around that topic. It also needs to be beneficial. And what do I mean by public engagement being beneficial? So often we may go into scenarios where we want to hear from families, we want to hear from people, we want to know what people are thinking, and that's great. But people need to be able to be engaged and feel tapped in. What do they get out of it? What does a community get out of it? We've heard time and time again from communities who've had researchers and different groups come in and almost like harvest their ideas and then leave and never come back. And that community is left saying, well, I gave you all this information, but we didn't really get anything out of that. So I think that's really important, especially at a time when people are stretched in a lot of different directions. And also, at the end of the day, the outcomes do need to be able to be applied broadly. Now, that doesn't mean your one focus group needs to be able to answer every single question under the sun, but it does mean when thinking of a broad-based public engagement strategy, you're hitting all of your main targets. And then that all leads to the true purpose of public engagement. It's not just advertising or just getting the word out, but it's really to have that dialogue where there's opportunity to problem solve, have communities make decisions, again, build trust and understanding. That theme will come on throughout this session, and to ensure that a range of views are not just heard, but really have that opportunity to shape outcomes. One thing I like to talk to and say to groups that partner with us to do this type of work is if you're going to do that public engagement, it's really about a commitment to being able to iterate, to be able to actually said, well, you said this and we were able to do this from that. And based off of that, we're going to measure and we're going to bring back the data to you. Next slide. So I keep harping on this broad public engagement has to include representation. Again, I'm really looking at this for this session through that lens of newborn screening, 60-year-old program, and a program that really is population-wide and is a public health experience that basically every family goes through. Every family participates. And participation isn't just based off of getting a diagnosis, right? It is about from that heel prick all the way through. And though it can be challenging, trust so often is really heavily shaped by the experience of the majority, right? It's one of the reasons why we try to get stories out there about families who their child's genetic condition was caught early so that people can actually have a sense of that experience, because that isn't the majority's experience. It's a test, they go on, and then they go on with their life. But it is important to think about what does it mean to have a narrative be built based off of an experience that doesn't always exactly showcase all of the benefits of that early detection, right? Again, this is not a newborn genomic sequencing issue. This is an issue for all types of screening and something that we've dealt with in newborn screening, but could be really elevated or escalated when thinking about incorporating genomic sequencing. So those engagement strategies need to be able to, that's okay, need to be able to reflect that universal impact, even though we know we may be looking for a small number of kids, those rare disease kids, the impact is large. Next. So I think it's also important to think about what families are thinking about during this time, from that time of pregnancy through, those first few months. There's a lot going on, right? At the end of the day, parents want what's best for their children. And we always have to go back to that. Everyone wants what's best for their children, for them to have the best opportunities possible. Families are navigating truly an avalanche of information. We all are. We all are bombarded with messages and information at every turn. But during this particular time of pregnancy and early childhood, it really is, dialed up past 100 with something that's always around the corner. Now, some families can really like that. They're information seekers. They want to get more information. They want to go on to the next thing. But we've heard from a lot of families who say, I'm done with one testing, and then I get information about the next one, and the next one, and the next one. That's a reality that we really have to be able to help families navigate through, and not just say, no, 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 this is the next greatest, biggest thing, but really to say, all right, what is that family's experience? Have they had a lot of prenatal testing? What's their experience going to be going into thinking about genomic testing for their newborn? Or have they had no testing? What's that experience? This all can sound like a lot, but I want to be encouraging that this is the time where we get to learn that, where we get to be working on a number of different projects, both at the state and national and frankly global level, and coming together to get a real sense for these issues. And lastly, I already mentioned this in my last slide, but we have to remember families, their attention is pulled in multiple directions. And we need to have a level of respect and appreciation for that when thinking about public engagement strategies. Next slide, please. Great. So I won't go into too much detail on this. This is a framework for engagement that we at Expecting Health have built out and use when working with programs around thinking about their engagement strategies. One of the key pieces is engagement is not a one-time thing. It really is about, it's a state of mind, you could say. It's really about how you approach the work from design to implementation to evaluation and looping back around. And there are different steps that can get you towards that place of real engagement, as we were talking about, that two-way communication. It can start, and typically does start, with just raising awareness, letting people know that something is happening, piquing their interest, then moving into the idea of really building knowledge, right? This can be modules or, different things that you see in a clinical setting that you read and kind of get a bit deeper into, can sink your teeth into. But then we really get into that activation mode with 3 and 4 here. First, creating the opportunities. This is where I would say real engagement really starts, where you have, opportunities for community advisory boards or places for people to come together, share their perspectives, share their concerns, share how they would go and build something out, right? Really getting involved in that planning and creation. And then getting to the point of action. Engagement means action. It means being able to do something, co-create, as I said on the slide before. But really here's where you have families and members of the public and any community being partners in driving change, whatever that change may be, whether that's learning more, understanding the feasibility of the opportunity, being able to see, okay, what are our next steps? But again, really being that partner. Next slide, please. Okay, a lot of scary headlines, but I put this here not to shock or not to jolt, but to remind us that we are not creating a new narrative from scratch, right? There's a lot in the space and media around health, healthcare, and particularly around newborns and newborn screening. So we have to take that into account too when thinking about engaging the public, really raising awareness around the possibilities of genomic sequencing during the newborn period, and know that it is not in a vacuum. There's a lot out there. That's not to scare us off, but to really help us hone in on why having strong messaging and strong engagement strategies is so important. Next slide. I'm not going to delve too much into informed consent, but I wanted to bring it up here because it is a key piece in, of course, the process that we've been talking about around genomic sequencing. And just like public engagement is not a one-time thing, informed consent, it's a process. It's not a moment. Though we tend to think of that pen and just writing, and then that's it. We've got the informed consent. But it does. It really requires that understanding and choice and trust. So I really see those elements relating to that public engagement. We also know that a one-time decision doesn't necessarily reflect long-term implications, and people change their minds and ideas about things. How do we, at the point we are at right now, help to build infrastructure to support that basic human behavior of sometimes changing ideas or having an evolution of thought as you learn more? We know that people are going to come into this discussion with different levels of readiness and preference and ideas of timing. We need to be able to, again, build the infrastructure as we're designing pilot programs or research programs to really take this into account. Next slide, please. All right. Thanks. This is my last slide. We really, as I said, this is exciting because we are at the place where we can start to build, and I shouldn't say start because some of this infrastructure has been built, but to continue to build infrastructure around how we are going to measure and monitor people's perceptions and how their views of genomic sequencing is changing and evolving as it's coming closer and closer to reality for some families. The families and public have always been a big part of driving public health systems. both legislatively, and I think that's what media attention tends to go to, but even more behind the scenes, working with public health officials, working within communities to really ready people for a new public health initiative. So that is nothing new. That is the story of newborn screening. That's the story of public health in this country. And I see that continuing, of course. We tend to like to focus on technology, the numbers, how many genes, and scaling, but we also really need to have a focus on the long-term follow-up care. And I use care broadly here, both medical, social, familial, and getting the public engaged on that part too. That's really where we can have some nice dialogue and really get strong input, because it's about where the rubber hits the road for families and communities, and really treating engagement as a core infrastructure piece. I can't tell you how many times we've seen projects where engagement comes, in the last year of a grant or of a project. That doesn't work. It really didn't work before, and it definitely doesn't work now. And it's nice to see the programs that are being implemented now really take that to heart. And lastly, I just want to end on the fact that families are really the ultimate end users, and the truest test of if a system is working or not. And we've really been able, I think, in the past several years to orient newborn screening, traditional newborn screening, if you will, around that, and getting more families engaged and family feedback engaged, which has been amazing, and really looking forward to seeing that trend continue as we talk about genomic sequencing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you so much for always kind of centering the public in public health. It's a really great way for us to start this conversation and keep that in mind. So with that, I will turn it over to our speaker, Dr. Erin Goldenberg.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be with these panelists and with all of you. This is a set of topics that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm really glad to share some of my thoughts with all of you, and hope we can have some great conversations after the presentations. I think my comments will really resonate well with Natasha's presentation, especially as we start thinking about what kinds of ethical groundings or kind of initial foundational principles we use to justify newborn screening, and how do we make sure that we center the public in those considerations as we move forward and as programs evolve. And there's always going to be a intersection between ethics and public opinion, ethics and social values. And for me, ethics really is about values. And so as we start thinking about an evolving newborn screening program, I think it's really important to kind of center those values of parents and the public as we move forward. Next slide. I have nothing to disclose. Next slide. When I think about the ethics of genomic newborn screening, I think it's important for us to not start only looking forward, but to look a little bit in the past, look at where we've been and where the original justifications of newborn screening and newborn screening programs here in the United States and internationally are really based. What are the kind of moral frameworks that screening programs are based on? And so I think it's always good to take a step back and to say, okay, well, where have we been? Newborn screening has been justified by a number of different ethical principles over the last 60 years. This paper that I have on the screen that some of you may be familiar with from 1982 was really one of the first articles to kind of lay out the ethical justifications of compulsory newborn screening, specifically PKU at the time, but extending to other conditions. And the authors and others in the kind of bioethics and public health spheres have laid out, I think, kind of three primary principles that justify compulsory newborn screening. None of these are going to be surprising to any of you. The first one being child welfare, right? Benefiting the health of an individual newborn who is identified with a condition. That's the purpose of the program, right? That's the heart of our programs. Why do we justify compulsory and mandatory screening? And that's really based off of the harm principle. Anyone who took high school and college philosophy, or John Stuart Mill, right? Thinking about the fact that a parent's right to refuse screening for their child is outweighed by the positive harm that could come to a child if they were missed through screening. So we've taken away that particular kind of autonomy in favor of making sure that kids are caught, making sure their kids are identified. Now, of course, almost every program in the United States have some form of opt-out, either for religious or philosophical principles. But the idea is that the state believes that the benefit to a child outweighs informed consent. And we're going to come back to that a little bit to see where we are in terms of genomics. And then finally, this is the equity consideration, which is the principle of universal access. Right from the start, one of the reasons why newborn screening was integrated into public health, the public health sphere, was to make sure that every child would have access to screening. And that universal access, that universality, has been really at the core of state-based newborn screening programs for over 60 years and remains a core principle for screening as we move forward. Next slide. So then where are we when we start thinking about genomics and newborn screening? And I'm going to start by talking about the ELSI in genomics, genomic newborn screening, so the ethical, legal, and social issues that take place in the practice of doing genomic newborn screening. And as we start looking at what are the kind of the key ethical, legal, and social issues that are raised by integrating genomic testing into genomic screening, into newborn screening, none of these are going to be new, right? All of these things, as Amy said in her introduction, all of these topics that we're going to be talking today are ones that the newborn screening community has faced over the last 60 years in one way or another, but they're enhanced, they're more complex, they're more vexing in terms of how do we assure benefit and avoid harms. So you can see here, all the things that we've been talking about for the last 60 years are just coming back in an enhanced and more complex way. So the psychosocial impact of genomic information, the ethics of expansion. What do we do when we start looking at conditions that have adult onset variants? Or how do we handle carrier status? How do we consider genetic privacy and discrimination? Of course, informed consent, and that's where we're actually going to start our conversation today. Return of results, and we'll end by talking a little bit about some of the equity considerations in genomic newborn screening. But again, what you'll see here is none of these topics are foreign or new to the newborn screening community. They are all part of the things that we've been doing for the last 60 years, just in a very different way. Next slide. So let's start where Natasha really, I think, got us started thinking about this, which is, do we need informed consent as we move towards genome sequencing in the state newborn screening program? This is a question on everybody's mind. It's a debate happening live in many different settings, at your state level, at the national level, at the international level. And this really gets into the question is, how do we maintain the benefits of newborn screening, but consider whether or not we need to involve an informed consent process in some way in the integration of those technologies into our programs? And really, this comes down to, do we maintain a compulsory screening apparatus like we've done before, and just say, no, adding whole genome sequencing or genome sequencing, targeted genome sequencing, is just a new technology. It's just evolving the program. The justifications for compulsory screening should remain and shouldn't change. And so we should just add it and add more education and then keep the programs compulsory. There are others that believe that adding genomic sequencing changes the inherent nature of screening to the point where we want to actually increase parental autonomy, give more choice. And you can see here what I've said is that increasing that autonomy might be good to add choices to families, give families more control over whether they want genomic sequencing or not. But there is the potential that we might decrease screening coverage as more families say no. We know that we may miss more kids, which goes against the idea of universal access and the idea of trying to catch as many kids as possible through our programs. Now, it may not be as simple as just saying, well, newborn screening should all of a sudden have informed consent, or no, it should be compulsory. There are other options that we can put on the table. So for example, we could have tiered screening. We could have consent based on technology. So maybe biochemical testing would continue to be compulsory, but adding molecular testing, adding genomics would require consent. An alternative would be you get consent based on a type of condition. So as we start adding conditions, as we start expanding our genetic panels, maybe we look at things like severity, variable ages of onset, phenotypic variability, issues of uncertainty, and make decisions about whether or not there's a set of conditions that should remain mandatory while others become a choice, others become consented. But again, the core of this is how can we grow our programs while maintaining those current benefits to families in our state? I do want to say one thing, which is that sometimes when this is presented, it's presented in a way that says, if we start going down the road of parental permission and informed consent, we may reduce the benefits of screening for families. And I'm sensitive to that. But I do think it's a little bit of a false dichotomy. I think we need more data. I think we need more engagement, just as Natasha has said, with families to find out really how they would feel if there was informed consent for newborn screening. I think we need a lot more work together to make a decision on whether or not we really would reduce the benefits of screening if we were to move towards informed consent. Next slide. So some of the other things that I'm sure are on some of your minds in terms of some of the ethical, legal, and social issues, we always need to think about the kind of potential psychosocial impact or psychological impact that genetic information may have on families. There's always been kind of this concern that it might increase anxiety or potential psychological harms to family. It might impact family dynamics. As we do more genomic sequencing and potentially get more uncertain findings, whether those are variants of uncertain or certain significance or uncertainty with regard to phenotypic variability or uncertainty with regard to age of onset, are we potentially creating what has been called patience in waiting, where parents are kind of waiting to see whether or not their child may have a condition and what are the potential psychosocial impacts of that process? We just like we have with traditional screening, we're concerned about potential false positives and negatives. As we expand our panels, one of the questions that's been on a lot of folks' minds is what do we do about later onset conditions, variants that might be 60, 70% of those variants of a particular condition might be an adult onset. Do we give that information back? Do we hold to our kind of right to an open future that we've been operating for many years, saying that no, adult onset conditions should be things that individuals should decide as they come of age whether or not they want that information? Or do we switch our thinking a little bit to a best interest of the child standard and maybe start giving more later onset information to families? What do we do about carrier status and other kinds of information that it might impact reproductive decision making? Does that change the kind of ethical justification for mandatory screening? And of course, fears of genetic discrimination and stigmatization based on genetic information has not gone away. It's something that a lot of families are still really concerned about. And as we think about adding more genomic information to families' experiences, how do we confront the potential fears of genetic discrimination that families may have? Next slide. I just want to say something that about uncertainty, which is that as we increase the panels that we may be doing within our programs, as we increase the number of conditions we're screening for, a number of studies have seen that while genomic sequencing can reduce things like false positives and false negatives, the rate of uncertain findings has gone up in many of these studies. And what is the potential impact of uncertainty? And when I think about uncertainty, I think about it both in terms of diagnostic uncertainty, does a child have a condition or not, and then prognostic uncertainty. They have a diagnosis, but they don't know how sick their child might get, or when their child might get sick, or how treatable that condition might be for their child. We don't currently do a great job of assessing the impact, the harms and benefits of that uncertainty on families. There are a number of studies, including one that I'm doing with Dr. Beth Turini, on looking at how families address and think about uncertainty. And really the big question is, what kinds of support can we give to families so that they feel supported in addressing uncertainty, so that they feel that when there is uncertainty, they feel like they have the resources to deal with that uncertainty. Next slide. Of course, privacy considerations are at stake here, and Natasha did a great job of raising this question as well. There are going to be privacy concerns related to having a state have larger amounts of genomic sequence data. How can that data be shared? Who has access to that data? How often is it sent to hospitals? Is it shared with other states? Just in the last few days alone, there have been a number of new lawsuits, one new lawsuit in New Jersey, specifically on the handling of newborn screening blood samples and data. and this is something I know those of you in Minnesota are familiar with, as we start thinking about concerns around genetic privacy, how does genomic information change those concerns? And for me, the real crux of this is how do we build programs that increase and maintain trust in our programs as we expand. So as we move towards genomic sequencing and thinking about adding more conditions, how do we make sure that we can maintain trust in the system? And part of that is not so much about getting people to trust us, it's about making sure that we are trustworthy, making sure that we're building programs that are trustworthy to our families. I also just want to say one thing, which is that as we get more genomic information, one of the things that's coming up a lot is whether or not genomic information is truly identifiable or not. Currently, DNA, genomic sequence data, is not considered identifiable within human subjects protections programs, but it might be in the future. And we need to be thinking about what happens when genomic sequence data may make someone more identifiable. How do we protect families and protect individuals' privacy and families' privacy? Next slide. My last few slides, I want to get away from kind of the ethics and practice to think about ethics of systems, what I'm calling the ELSI of genomics in newborn screening. What is the potential impact on a whole at a 30,000-foot level? Not so much how do we do consent right, not it's so much how do we return results or how do we address uncertainty, but at a much larger level, should we be doing this? What are the potential implications of the newborn screening on the newborn screening system if we add whole genome sequencing or we add targeted genomic sequencing? Could we potentially hurt our programs? Could we potentially actually have a negative impact on the benefits that parents experience? How do we go about assessing these harms and benefits across a very large system in one state or across multiple states? And then finally, can we maintain equity? Can we maintain that universality that is so central to newborn screening? And in order to do that, I think we need to do a couple things. We need to assess family values, just as Natasha's been saying. We need to facilitate dialogue, and we need to promote stewardship. You all, as program leaders, us in the newborn screening committee, we are stewards of these data. We are stewards of these programs. How do we maintain those programs in ways that really protect the programs for families? Next slide. This is my last slide. I know I'm running out of time, so I just want to quickly say that as we think about equity and as we think about access, I want you to all to think about it on two different levels. This is something that I think is really important. One, which is who can access screening. Do we have a program, especially as we add genomics, that makes sure that genomic sequencing isn't just available, but it's accessible to everyone? What are the potential costs? What are the potential issues around making sure that people can get to clinical centers, making sure that people are able to get screening itself? And then if you click one more slide, that's only one side of the coin. The other side is we can get people screened, but who can access care? And that's where really we move from accessibility to truly equity. We know that many families are already experiencing health disparities. We know that families are experiencing multiple determinants of health. How do we create family support services and follow-up as in not just a way to make sure that people get screened, but that people can actually access care? And I think that's going to be essential as we expand programs to include genomic sequencing. We have to think about both screening and care access and follow-up. I think if you go to the next slide, I think that's where I'll end. Looking forward to I just want to say very, very quickly that I think if you take those original three principles, we need to kind of expand the way we think about those three principles. So if we're thinking about child welfare, we need to think about expanded notions of harms and benefits in a genomic system. If we think about the harm principle, what happens when we start integrating potentially informed consent? Do we change the way we think about how parents get access to screening? And then how do we change our systems to have wider lenses on disparities and equity across the entire newborn screening system? Okay, now I'm done. If you go to the next slide. Thank you so much. I want to thank my collaborators on many of these thoughts, and that is my daughter getting her newborn screen. She's now 12 and incredibly embarrassed that I show that picture in all of my slides. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron. It truly is always I think, so helpful to have you put this topic into the broader context of society and politics, and not in a way that says we shouldn't necessarily go forward, but in a way that reminds us of, what is all at stake and the responsibilities we have as we think about doing this in the best way possible. So I hope that everyone on this call is starting to see all of the various components that really do need to be considered as we potentially embark on implementing genomics for healthy newborns. And thus far, we've talked about kind of, I guess, the 3 E's of education, engagement, and ethics. And now I'm honored to turn it to Dr. Chung, who will talk to us, I think, about putting this all together into a sequencing program and lessons that they've learned from their studies. So, Dr. Chung.
Thanks, Amy. It's a hard act to follow, Natasha and Aaron, so I'll try my best. In doing this, I hope that I can give some empirical data from what we've experienced and tried to think through all of these things, but be able to give some sense of real world evidence to what's evolving. And so we've done this through the Guardian study that I've been doing for the last 3.5 years with genomic newborn screening. And I'll try and keep this relatively brief. Next slide. As we did this, also to declare conflicts of interest, we are sponsored by in-kind support, not direct dollars, but in-kind support from Illumina and GeneDx to provide the genetic testing. Next slide. Let me say that as a backdrop, and I took these slides out because I knew I was limited in time. I started about 10 years ago in the newborn screening space with doing pilot studies, but my actual history and training goes back. I was thinking about it last night in a scary way, 35 years when I started thinking about phenylketonuria and worked at NIH with Seymour Kaufman. And really what today is, when I'm talking to you about this, is the culmination of what I've been thinking about for a long, long time, even before the Human Genome Project started. And in a good way, listening to patients in terms of what that journey has been for them. We did in New York State, working actually on the shoulders or building off of what Catherine Swoboda did in Utah with SMA newborn screening, and provided some of the critical evidence for the application and eventual acceptance to the recommended universal screening panel. And the reason I mention that is because as we did that pilot study for SMA, I began to talk with parents who actually screen negative to understand what else they would want in their screening. And so that was the beginning of a very long conversation, as I said, starting over 10 years ago. And it was actually our families who designed the Guardian study, essentially. We had many reciprocal conversations to try and figure out and educate them about what was possible, and then gradually evolving this. And I think that's one of the key learnings for me, is this constant learning. And I'll say it's on a week-to-week basis in terms of talking with anyone and everyone that's touched by this. And I really encourage the bringing this now to the public square, as we know that there's, from a feasibility point of view, as I'll talk to you about, I do think we and others have demonstrated that it is feasible. Doesn't mean we should do it, but it means it's feasible. And it means we have this ability now to start carving or sculpting what the it is. So as we talked with families about this, they continued to say the newborn screening process, and I agree with Natasha and Aaron, it's not just screening, but it's confirmation of the diagnosis and onboarding to care is the way I phrase it. But what are the ways to be able to take that same spirit of newborn screening and add a different platform, but still trying to achieve the same goals, I guess, is the underlying premise that I would have through this. And when I think about that, to me, it's about leaving no one behind and setting up a public health infrastructure to allow the next generation of children to reach more, to achieve more of their potential in terms of health and happiness, and for their families as well. And so that's what this is predicated upon. And it brings in genomic sequencing, in part because that platform of doing, we've used whole genome sequencing, which admittedly is still costly, but all the cost is coming down. But building that in as a flexible platform, because I truly believe there are going to be improvements in treatments, and we want to be able to minimize, or at least I would like to minimize, the time from new treatment availability to implementation and access for the kids who need it. And so it's really that flexibility that we use the whole genome sequencing, but we don't read everything out. And I think that's a key factor. And then, as you've heard, it's the question of what do you read out? well. Next slide. So within this, it is important to be able to know about the natural history of those conditions and to make sure that the treatments really are as effective as we think they are. In doing this, though, it is a different paradigm. It's a lot more information in particular. And let me say very specifically that Guardian is a consented research study. I do believe we're still in the phase of it being research. It's not, I don't think, yet ready yet for prime time implementation, because as you'll see, there's still some things that we need to optimize, refine, and improve before we really do think about something like nationwide implementation. In doing this, one of the things we heard from families is that this is a little different. This is getting into new territory. And so I do think, bringing this to the public and a discussion in the public square is really important and will help in terms of the education and engagement. But at the very least, while it's still not something that's widely known, we've been starting the education process within the third trimester of the pregnancy when there's more time for, I hope, thoughtful consideration. But at least for now, we've also been going postpartum in the birth hospitals to talk families through the process, answer any questions, and give them up to 30 days after birth for that consenting process. When we did this, we started out with what I call version 1 of the genes that we included. And we included it initially what I thought was still a significant number of genes, about 238 genes, but we knew that was not going to be the final gene list, but I didn't know what it was going to be like. I didn't know how much effort it was going to be, how many false positives we'd have. So I did this in what I thought was a conservative way to make sure we could do it. And then we've expanded from that. Our version 2 has 447 genes. Our version 3, which will launch soon, will have a couple hundred genes in addition. And I don't anticipate it getting much larger than that. And I'll also say with each version, we even take genes off. So we learn and we iteratively improve. In doing this, I will say that we wait until regular newborn screening is done. We blind ourselves to that regular newborn screening result, and then we take the residual sample so that we don't require any additional sample. And I believe that's an important part of this process, and then begin the sequencing and resulting out. And right now, we've gotten that down to about 3 weeks. I think the fields could get it down shorter turnaround time if we were doing this on scale. And I think we've now shown that we could do this in parallel with using that dried blood spot in part for biochemical and other screens and in part for newborn sequencing. Importantly, in Guardian, it doesn't end with that screening result, but it's confirmation and it's onboarding to care. Next slide, and I'll go more quickly through the next slides. And you can just toggle through until you get to the end here. Importantly, families told us that they would want us to focus on news they could use, that is treatable conditions where the action or the symptoms would begin at less than 5 years of age. So we've tried to be true to those principles, and where there was a fairly high certainty that the child would have those symptoms or need treatments within those first 5 years, we've operationalized that to greater than 90%. Importantly, though, there was disagreement in the community about what was actionable enough to include in newborn screening. We operationalized that into group 1 conditions, which would meet the criteria that we currently have for newborn screening in terms of treatments that are available and extremely effective. But some families included, for instance, seizures, where control of the seizures with anti-epileptic medications and early recognition clearly improves outcome, but there still might be residual symptoms afterwards, some neurodevelopmental issues in particular. And given that we never came to consensus with any of the families, we left that as an optional module. And I'll get to it, but the majority of families have wanted that information. Next slide. As we've done this, we have one of the things to think about when we think about equity and some of the ethical issues is that this study is currently being done in New York City, which, as you'll see, has a very diverse community, which in a good way has pushed us to be able to understand the variant interpretation. And it was my strong opinion that we needed to be equitable within that. And given that there are biases in our data sets about interpretation of those variants, I optimized what I thought was a balance between sensitivity and specificity, that for autosomal recessive conditions, we would require at least one pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant, but we would allow for up to one variant of uncertain significance for those recessive conditions. For a variant that was uncertain, yet leaning towards likely pathogenic, as long as we had an orthogonal means of confirming that diagnosis. And that, I think, has proven to be important. You do always always suffer some false positives, and I'll just put in a gratuitous comment that we in the field are working towards being able to resolve those with assays that can be done on the dried blood spot as tier 2 test to be able to optimize, again, sensitivity and specificity, but before we have to call the families with that. Next slide. Just very briefly, and you can toggle through that also very quickly. We have gone through the process that includes other testing, including parental testing to understand what we call phasing for recessive conditions. And you can keep toggling through, as well as being able to have orthogonal tests. In doing that, we cover the cost of that under the Guardian research study. Next slide. As we're going forward, this is an important point, again, for empirical data. As we've done this, 74% of parents who have been offered the study have decided to do the study. On the upper right, you can see that it's a majority minority population, and that's reflective exactly of the hospitals in which we've offered this, 6 hospitals in New York City. This is our outcome data freeze for our first 10,000 that we've enrolled. We're currently at over 22,000. We've done this with in English, Spanish, as well as Mandarin, and the community, the uptake rate has perfectly reflected the community in those hospitals, those that deliver in the hospitals. So we are not seeing biases, and I credit that to our coordinators, who I think do a very good job of explaining this and answering questions. Within this, most individuals do consent on the lower left prior to discharge, although there are about 4% of the population that take some time, up to 30 days after birth, and of course that's perfectly fine. And on the lower right, you can see that about 92-93% of individuals do decide to do the optional module of the group 2 conditions. So it is the majority. Next slide. As we've gone forward with this, I've divided out the results into group 1 and group 2, and we expected and have seen that the majority of results are in group 1. We see about 3.3% of individuals with positive results. Over time, that has decreased to a little less than 3%, and that's largely because where we are decreasing are the false positives. So we're getting better at being able to interpret the information. And again, that's part of why I say this is still in research mode. I still think we are learning and refining as we go forward. As an example, within the first 1,000, we actually had a cystic fibrosis variant present in 11 individuals, 11 out of the 1,000, that we quickly learned was actually one of those false positives. We've removed that, and it's in a similar vein that we continue to refine everything we do going forward. Next slide. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because I know they're data dense, but this is the group of conditions that are part of standard newborn screening, and we've now added genetic sequencing to be able to think about an orthogonal way of looking at the data and test ourselves in a blinded fashion to see how good we were. That way we had a positive control. I'm happy to say that we were able to detect everything standard newborn screening should have detected. We didn't miss anything, is the point. So we didn't have, to our knowledge, in these first 10,000, any false negatives. We did, however, identify, rarely, but importantly, very important, and I would argue life-saving cases that were missed by standard newborn screening. Not to blame anything, but to say that there are synergistic improvements we can achieve. Next slide. So now I'm going to go through just very briefly some examples. G6PD deficiency is the most common of the conditions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through it, except to say that I consider this an interesting challenge in that really, ideally, we should have these results within the first few days of life. We have not met what is really the clinical need, and that's because this could be used to manage jaundice, and we simply, the way the workflow is right now is not set up for that. But this is a very, very common result and could have useful information beyond the neonatal period in terms of something we call hemolytic anemia, with easy ways to intervene and prevent those episodes. And this is something that we see mostly in a non-white population. And again, depending on the demographics of the state, might have a higher or lower frequency of positives than what we've seen in Guardian. Next slide. I'll also say importantly at the bottom that parents have been very appreciative overall of everything, but especially conditions that have been relatively not burdensome for them. This is one of the cases that standard newborn screening missed. This was a case of severe combined immunodeficiency that was intended to be screened but missed. And again, I'm not playing the blame game here, but we were able to identify this little boy as having an IL-2RG mutation. We could then go back to a functional assay and confirm the diagnosis, use the literature about this exact mutation to say that it was either lethal or required a bone marrow transplant, and convened a national group of experts in inborn errors of immunodeficiencies that gave the unanimous consensus to do a bone marrow transplant within the first 100 days before a serious infection. And we did that for this little boy, and he is post-bone marrow transplant, thriving, never had any significant infections, and now even has a younger sibling who is fine and been part of Guardian as well. Next slide. Within this, these are the group 1 conditions that are not included within standard newborn screening currently. I won't go through a lot of details except to say that there are false positives, and we're finding informatic ways of being able to improve that. And as we get more diverse, if you will, comparator data or reference data, as I was alluding to, we're getting better and better at this. And so I'm optimistic that we can remove many of the false positives. We have also determined really important ways to support families during that time, minimize the time for the confirmation, make it easier for them to do testing from home, making sure that we're supporting those families, importantly, whether they end up being true positives or false positives, and have a team of a geneticist, genetic counselor, work closely with the pediatricians, have a patient navigator, and then a team that includes many subspecialists. We call them subject matter experts who are helping us that are based on the particular condition. And so in doing this, and as I said, being able to cover this through the Guardian study has been important. Next slide. Just very briefly, I'll give you a couple examples that have, I think, been truly transformational. And I will say that having practiced in New York City for 25 years, the other thing that's been very clear to me is that seeing the population and knowing how people access care, I'm absolutely sure that we really did save lives, and in this case, save vision. Just knowing how communities, based on their ability to access care, their insurance access. Kids really don't have choices about that, and it's important to me to give all kids this same chance at a healthy future. This was one of our little, actually relatively recent and still very active, one of our children, actually our only so far, thankfully, with a retinoblastoma mutation. Once we realized that was the case, we brought him in terms of having an eye exam, and identified already at the young age of 6 weeks old, had 8 tumors across both of his eyes. We're able to treat those and actually save vision and continue the screening. Have continued to find small tumors that we've been able to treat and start chemotherapy as well. And again, this is still a work in progress, but been incredibly important for this child. And this was a de novo mutation, so his family would not have known to do this were it not for the screening. Next slide. One of the more one other condition that is also a work in progress, and this gets to one of the comments that was made earlier. This is a case of a child with metachromatic leukodystrophy. In this case, the parents actually had carrier screening during pregnancy. So we are trying to integrate this into the whole lifespan and the family's journey. They had elected not to get any prenatal diagnosis, and we at the time didn't know about the carrier screening, but confirmed this diagnosis. And there is gene therapy for this condition. And so this is one of the things that this child is able to have access to. We confirm the diagnosis again with enzymatic testing, have a sense in terms of severity of illness, and again, recommendation to go forward with the genetic therapy and have a strong partner that's working with the family on this. Next slide. One of the other conditions that actually ends up being very common, 1 in 800 individuals, is long QT syndrome. This can be a cause of sudden infant death syndrome. And so we've worked very closely with the SADS community that works with sudden deaths. This is something that can have a very variable sort of expression or clinical manifestations. We're very cognizant of that. And one of the good things we found is that it's easy to access an EKG, and we've been able to use with our subject matter experts the quantitative data we get out of an EKG, the actual QT interval, to risk stratify along with the parental genotypes in the family history. And so this is just one of our little babies getting their first EKG. Next slide. As we've done this, we've identified not only the babies who are at high risk, a small percentage, but important percentage who have needed to start beta blockers. More importantly, though, all of them are being managed with avoiding medications that can make this worse or trigger an episode. And it may turn out that just avoiding that is really what a very easy way to be able to prevent those adverse outcomes. And given this dominant condition, have had the secondary benefit, certainly not our primary intention, but the secondary benefit of identifying other family members, importantly parents, who've been able to access this information and be able to use it in a positive way for themselves as well. Next slide. So within this, I'll just very briefly say, because I alluded to the group 2 conditions, this is certainly a much smaller portion of what we're trying to do. But as we've done this, we have identified many true positives. I will say that this is important information, but hard information, or harder information, I would say, for families to deal with, because it is more of an adjustment. Again, as I alluded to, we can certainly, I think, improve outcomes, but there are still some residual symptoms. And so this is an important discussion that we have with families. But all in all, we have figured out ways to help them navigate through things like access to early intervention, importantly, accessing the appropriate neurologist, behaviorist in terms of doing things. And the longer we see these kids coming out, the more I can see that it's actually having a positive impact. So there is certainly an adjustment period to the information, the onboarding to care, but I do think we're actually having a positive impact in terms of our longer term outcome. But that's these are early days, and we need to keep following these children and their families. Next slide. Just to give one example, this is a case of a child with a Rett-like syndrome, and I'm getting to wrapping up. This is the first EEG showing the first major grand mal seizure, and knowing this has been helpful in terms of seizure management. Next slide. So in trying to start taking this and putting it all together, you can just flip through. Within this, the take-home messages are, I think, empirically, it's important to see how families, what they think of this, as I said, how to be able to think about not just consenting, but the whole journey going through this. And we are doing long-term outcomes. We're following each of our individuals a month after disclosure, and then each year, each birthday, or shortly thereafter for each of the children, and understanding both the family experience, the provider experience, and the medical outcomes within this. So I won't say that we've learned everything, but as we've done this, we have been, I think, operationally having resources, bringing in patient advisors, subject matter experts, not only medically, but parent-wise, to help families through this journey. And I think in a positive way, as I said, we continue to improve and go fast enough that we can see what we need to do, but not getting over our skis and not doing anything that's reckless. Next slide. So as we go forward, I do think there are benefits, and that's why we've continued to expand in terms of the number of conditions. I can see that there could be secondary benefits going forward, but again, I think we should talk about this as we go through the discussion. I will say that we've learned that what we thought we knew about many of these rare diseases, we have to relearn. That's been the case always for newborn screening. And I will just leave you with the thought that even though a condition might be appropriate for newborn screening, I think I'm realizing that not every single variant in those genes is necessarily appropriate for newborn screening. So it's adding a nuance and a complexity that's our problem on the genetic side to work through. But I do think it's an important thing for our genetics community to help contribute to be able to get to where we need to be if we are to implement this. Next slide. I'll just finally wrap up by saying that if anyone would like to nominate a condition or give us feedback, the email address is there. And importantly, last slide, to thank everyone who's been a part of this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chung, and thank you for all of your truly and remarkably incredible work. And in really thinking through so many of these components and kind of getting the ball rolling and how this might look. So I know we have just a few minutes for Q&A, so I'll turn it over to Dr. Logan Spector to lead that session.
Thanks, everybody. So I'm not sure that our Q&A is working as planned, so I can't see if there are any audience questions. I'll ask the people who actually made this Teams instance to let me know if there's any hot ones in there. But in the meantime, I'm great at extemporizing, and so I have a couple of questions for everybody. I actually just want to fix on one point you made, Aaron, about the identifiability of genomic data. I think most lay people would be surprised to hear that there's any debate about that. Can you elaborate on what you see the debate as?
Sure. So up until this point, DNA in and of itself, so sequence data in and of itself, is not considered by the federal government or really any state government to be identifiable if all you have is sequence data. Um, there have been a number of studies, though, over the last 10 years that have looked at whether or not you might be able to take sequence data and potentially identify someone by looking at other publicly available databases. Some of those programs have been more successful than others, and so it's raised a question about whether or not it's time to identify genomic sequence data as one of the, as PHI, as personally as patient identifiable information. That has not happened yet, and I think it's probably a little bit far off. But I think the concern is that if someone were to be able to be identifiable with just their genomic information, how do you protect that in a way that is robust? And so, DNA is not currently one of the HIPAA identifiers, but there has been some discussions within the genetics and bioethics community about whether or not someday it may be. I personally do not think it is at this point, but I do understand why someone might be concerned about someone having a big amount of their sequence data, their whole genome or something like that. So I think this is an evolving conversation. I think we'll see over the next 2, 3, 10 years, but it's something for us to be thoughtful about as we build our programs and build our privacy structures.
Thank you. So
Logan, I'm just going to jump in. Are you able
Yeah.
to see the Q&A? I'm sorry. Are you able to see the questions?
they
that are
just-
being
I am
submitted?
now. Suddenly
Okay,
I am.
Super. Super.
So, but I'm going to go ahead and ask the question that I had on deck while I look over these. So I think that this question may mostly be for Natasha. How can we better engage families and parents that have tended to be harder to reach, especially in the current climate? And we're not trying to we're in a bubble here talking about just gNBS, but there's a larger environment in Minnesota of we'll say a changing relationship between the levels of government and the people. In this current climate, how do we obtain the perception and needs around gNBS?
Yeah, I think that's a really critical question, not just for Minnesota, but really across the country. And it kind of goes back to basics in terms of really before going out and trying to get your or our answers, we need to go out and really understand where the communities are at. And in terms of wanting to engage in these types of dialogues, and this is why really building those partnerships first with those trusted groups. And that can look different in different places. People still are interested in health and health care. And like I said, being the best parents they can be and whatever that may mean for them. But I think it's really starting those conversations from a place of partnership, not just from a place of getting the data, getting the information to keep our research programs going or our initiatives going. But it is extremely challenging. And I think it's actually really helpful to call out the challenges. It's not just families that are certain communities are hard to reach. There are barriers, very real ones, and very real not to go too far down this, but very real risks for them in doing so. And I think us, as the people who are trying to build these programs and get this information, we just have to, at the very least, call it out. So we're working from a place of reality.
I think, Erica, we're actually at time.
Yeah,
I
we
wonder
are.
if we have time for one more question, or should we call it off and we can answer in an FAQ?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know that there are a few questions in the chat, and for the sake of time, we won't be able to get to them. But Logan, I think that's a great idea. What we can do is read over those and send out some responses. We'll be sending this recording. This is recorded, and we can send out some materials afterwards. So I think just for the sake of honoring the time. So I just want to thank the panelists so much for providing this amazing information. I think you've given the state of Minnesota a real gift in helping us set some context and some paradigms. I have no doubt that we're going to be revisiting this recording as we, embark on contemplating the use of genomic sequencing in the state of Minnesota, and as we embark on this world. So thank you all so much, and plug for our in-person meeting that will be coming up in February. I'm sure we'll be able to address a lot of these conversations. We'll be sending out information about that third and final session on this topic. So thank you all so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.